Hello and welcome to Identirati Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue, and today is episode 41, National ID Challenges. Our guest today is Hasni Dubu, who's an identity consultant from Kinshasa, Congo, and Joni Brennan, president at the Digital ID and Authentication Council of Canada, or as we more commonly call it, DIAC. So welcome. And maybe
Thanks.
before we start, we could do some quick intros. Hasni, can we start with you? Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the invite, Mike. So I'm Hosni Dube, as you said. I'm a specialist in cybersecurity and identity. I've started working in identity, when it comes to governance, life cycle, employee partner identity, role-based access control, and then got a little bit into really interested into attribute-based access control, and then from there, customer identity, and that's how we got to working in identity.
Right. And you have sounds like an enterprise background, and you're trying to going to apply that to more government and institutional. So, but yeah,
Exactly.
it's and welcome our first guest from the Congo, and actually you're the first person I ever talked to from the Congo. Um, and Joni, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me as a guest identity today. My background is that I started my career in nonprofit with the IEEE ISTO, which is all focused on industry standards development. So I started working there, focused on standards for different technology, different types of technologies. Through that, I ended up supporting projects in an organization called Liberty Alliance, where I first got introduced to identity management and identity assurance and all those topics around it. And from there, I went on to lead organizations, previously Kantara Initiative and now the DIAC. So really my whole focus of my career, 20 plus years, has been on the nonprofit sector and on helping organizations of different kinds, public and private sector, small, medium, and large, to find areas where they want to collaborate and they want to develop frameworks and standards to help people's lives be better by using digital.
Cool. So, and Canada, for those who don't know, Canada has a very thoughtful approach to identity, and it's been going on for a long time, and it rivals, I think, the EU or the US in terms of I don't know, you guys just do a really good job at thinking about these hard things. I want to set the context today a little bit. I think it's what we've seen is that there's been a number of approaches in national ID. We have a initial European approach where we maybe issue physical cards, smart cards. We've seen in Canada, for example, to access government services, people use their bank ID. And that's been very, very successful, I would say. And then in the UK, we see maybe a different approach, a private sector approach, where the government has said, we're not going to issue you a national ID card. We're going to rely on private providers to eKYC, and then we're going to trust those attributes. So I did want to focus a little bit on the foundational identity part of national ID. And maybe, Hasni, I'll start with the question for you is maybe, can you talk a little bit about the foundational identity challenges you're facing and what you see as maybe some of the likely approaches that the Congo should consider? Hasni, we're not, you there? Uh-oh. Technical difficulties. Well, okay, Joni, this is why we always have two guests at
No problem.
Identity Towers. Once I disconnected and my guest just kept talking, which was great. So
No
we'll switch to you. And
Okay.
what do you think about this? I mean, is it true that Canada is really taking this bank ID approach? And is that is that going forward, or are there maybe some second thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, I think that in my experience on the Canadian side of this space and this work, I think it's I'll even use something and a saying that I know from the United States, which is around forming a more perfect union. I think meaning that the project is never done. It's always working to improve and be better. And so I would say within the Canadian ecosystem, I see it more as I see it a bit as forming that more perfect union, meaning that it continues to evolve. And so the bank ID approach has been, I think, very successful within our ecosystem. And now there is still work to be done and work that's happening to try to bring in jurisdictional provincial credentials along with federal credentials. And so really it's kind of more of a developing credential ecosystem um, that continues to evolve. And the bank credential approach is using an IDP. You're able to log in with that bank credential. And now the move is kind of how do we implement wallets and verifiable credentials as well. And I always, when I talk with people, I always like to stress that I think it's a additive excuse me, I think it's an additive ecosystem, meaning that I don't see exactly that one solution disappears and then a new solution comes in and replaces that. We tend to kind of add capabilities into that ecosystem, and some capabilities are going to work better for some people and some will work better for others. So yeah, it is an evolution and an evolutionary approach that we hope gets better and better as we go. And then kind of one piece I wanted to leave on for this question, Mike, as well, as you talked about foundational identity systems. And one thing that I've observed in Canada is that from a regulatory and legal perspective, the term foundational identity means something very specific. So I don't know about other jurisdictions, but for us, it's defined as a birth certificate or a permanent resident card as those
Yeah.
credentials. And in fact, a birth certificate is not to the same degree of assurance as a permanent resident card. That if you've I immigrated to Canada. So if you immigrate, you have background checks and biometrics and all of these kinds of verifications that go into your permanent resident card that make it very strong. That's a very strong
Uh-huh.
foundational piece of identity. A birth certificate arguably is still largely a piece of paper without a photo on it. So from a legislative perspective, there's a bit of a mismatch there when we say that word foundational. So we really have to look at the assurance and the verification that's gone into that credential. And a birth certificate could potentially be one of them, but we're not at the place yet to bring that to a bank to get verified for KYC AML, for example.
Great. Man, sorry, my screens are off now. It looks like Husney
No
dropped. He's
worries.
probably reconnecting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's true also in the United States that our birth certificate is based on is our foundational identity document, and that's sort of like one of the questions is that okay, what if we didn't have that and we could start and build something new? I don't think we'd base it on birth certificates, or maybe we would. I don't know. But
Apology, I believe
Husney,
sorry, apology, I believe
Welcome
the
back,
mic.
Hosni.
Yeah, apologies. I believe I might have some issues with the
uh,
weather today, which is affecting the internet. Is it any better now?
You're perfect. So everything
Wonderful.
has happened once on Identity office hours, including me getting disconnected. Hosni, I'll put the question back to you. Um, so could you tell us a little bit about what types of foundational identity exist today? For example, how does a person open a bank account? Um, and where do you see what are some of the challenges that you're looking to solve just in defining a new foundational identity procedure and process?
Well,
Uh,
in terms of foundational ideas, well, yeah, that is one of the main issues. Mainly, I'll say the main foundational ID that people will have will be birth certificates. And then some will use voting cards or passports, driving licenses, which now have stopped being issued. So they will use different documents with different standards, different protocols to access the same services, such as opening a bank account. But as far as national ID goes, there's none. So that's cause, of course, the issues when it comes to opening bank accounts. You have the everything that's compliance, know your customers for the anti-money laundering as the countering of financing terrorism. So, and then some banks could lose their peer banking licenses because of that, and then you have a lack of visibility. And when it's time to have government to people funds of reliefs, we've seen the use case during COVID. It's hard to identify the population that needs to relief, right? To have them bankerized and be able to identify themselves to receive those funds. So essentially, yes, foundational idea is, so, I mean, I would say the main challenge when it comes to that.
Interesting. So you have there is some process for asserting your identity, but to access national services, right now the people might have a number of online accounts. Is that right? So maybe there's one portal for healthcare, or one portal to get benefits, or one portal to pay taxes. Like, how once you how do you interact digitally? And is that one of the things that the Congo is looking to modernize?
Yes, because absolutely, to go back a few years before, or a few decades, the government was issuing funds via cash, right, even to public workers. And then came the digital revolution with the request to have some traceability when it comes to fund, and also have better processes to save funding, to save time, and to really accommodate people or folks with low mobility, right? And then with that, the idea of digital platforms and of optimization of processes. And yes, with that, online accounts to which you need to register for services, for taxes, etc. Certain services are really half digitalized, which caused an issue. But in order to get that sorted, you need that identity also. I would say progress.
Um, Joni Hazni mentioned COVID. I believe Canada also had some. I think every country had challenges dealing with COVID and identity. Did you see any um, challenges specifically or intersect between identity and COVID in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we saw challenges. Well, yes, there were challenges. We had the benefit of being able to, um, because the financial ecosystem was already very engaged on authentication for a person to use their banking credential, for that level of authentication. And our Canadian Bankers Association, CBA, they report that Canada is a very highly banked jurisdiction. So, of people who are eligible to have bank accounts, 99% do have bank
Hmm.
accounts. So this means we had foundations of adoption already that we could work with. So this was a good thing. Um, you know, that said, the banks did have to work overtime to make sure that we had something called the Canadian Emergency Resource Benefit. I think it or COVID CERB anyway. And this was the government providing subsidies, providing support for people who were facing challenges during COVID. The banks did have to work overtime to make that funding back into the bank account flow quickly and
Hmm.
smoothly and with security. Um, at the same time, during because the federal government was providing resources, entitlements back to people to support them during CERB, that ecosystem became an area for attack. It became, something that attackers wanted to get access to. And during the time when CERB was being distributed, there was an attack in this model that you're speaking of around the financial credentials. People can choose to use their financial credential. There was also a federally issued credential and managed credential that people could choose that one if they didn't want to use their bank. The federal credential was hacked with a credential stuffing attack during COVID, during that benefit, and the attackers, were doing that to get access to those funds, and they did. So certainly there was challenges both in helping to get those funds out quickly, and then in a new area of attack for attackers to go after. I think it also, that was challenge based. COVID also showed an opportunity because, in countries where you have more of a singular government structure and model, it's kind of a different approach, perhaps, or different conditions, for how to put forward identification and credentials.
I.e., not in the United States.
Well, yeah, Canada is very similar to the U.S. in that way, in the sense of, we have a federation, and if you're born in Canada, your identity, your legal instantiation comes from your province, but the health in Canada is regulated at the provincial level. So having a vaccine credential was an area where actually the ecosystem did excel. And they showed that even though there may have been some not exactly the same approaches to issuing the vaccine credential and how to kind of get that across to people, ultimately each provinces were able to demonstrate that capability, and then the federal government did a federal wrapper for people who wanted to travel outside of those jurisdictions. So definitely some positives came through on how we could work together, and some challenges were seen and some attacks were seen as well over that period.
Right. What do you think about in the U.S. we have a company called ID.me. So if you want to file your taxes, you can actually use your ID.me account because they have KYC'd you. And as I mentioned, England is taking a similar approach. There's a company called Yoti that has been authorized by the UK government to KYC, and then you can use those credentials. Is there a private market like that also in Canada? And do you see something like that possibly evolving?
What I see is an ecosystem where all of these capabilities are viable. If you think about using the banking credential to access federal government services, that is not very different from what the UK is putting forward on, doing eKYC and relying on financial eKYC to bring, individuals into that ecosystem. I think it's very similar for the US. And when I did the work in the US, it was looking at organizations like ID.me as well as telecommunications providers. So I think there's definitely an ecosystem approach for organizations to provide those levels of verification. And for a question like that, Mike, I tend to think about it, there's the issuer side who's issuing these credentials. Certainly a government issued credential is one type of credential. A private sector issued credential as well from a regulated industry like a financial institution. And then on the other side is the verifier or the relying party. And it's really up to the relying party, in some cases regulated, what do they accept, and in other cases their risk tolerance on what they accept. In the Canadian ecosystem, I think we have room for all of those models to exist at the same time, and so it's important to know how much you can trust. What is the level of verification that's gone into these different credentials?
Right. Hosni is back. Don't we? There's a Murphy's Law approach with these live streams too. So
Anything that
Hosni, we're talking about basically, let's say, third-party credentials, like a third-party identity provider going out and vetting a portion of the population, and then maybe the government trusting those credentials. Like, for example, your bank eKYCs you, and the government can trust the bank. But I wanted to expand the scope a little bit and say, what about third parties maybe who want to consume this identity data? For example, in India, a lot of people know the example that to get on a dating site, the dating site might ask you for your Aadhaar number because they want to verify you're real, or they want to be able to, track back to the real person. Um, do you see demand, Hasni, in the Congo for third parties to use this verified data and for better authentication services?
Yes, I believe that could work. Of course, the question is eventually to know the limitations of the data. What data could they access? What could they not access? The respects of the privacy, the efficient and reliable control. But then I believe that could be a model that will work.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting, right? Because when you talk about Aadhaar, um, one of the concerns is that a correlatable identity identifier could enable you, to be correlated in a way that you might not want. And so,
Mhm.
actually, Joni, I'll ask this question to you. Um, so, do you see in Canada also these requirements from third parties to consume? And do you see the government's role maybe in providing, like the UK government has formed like a department of attributes, and
Yeah.
but do you see maybe that we're going to, when it comes to private sector use of these attributes, that maybe the government has a role to play in creating a trust framework for that?
Um, I think that I would see that there may be, when I think about trust frameworks, and sometimes we use words in this industry and we might mean the same thing and we might mean different things. And so, in the trust framework, as a set of um, guidances that help to codify and extend different technical standards to reduce risk and to build assurance, is how I'm referring to it. As a tool for compliance as well. We see that there will be potentially multiple trust frameworks. This may be jurisdictional. They may be industry based if there's something kind of more specific for an industry. We certainly hope there's not 1,000 trust frameworks, but there may be a number of them. Um, and then to your question about third party reliance on credentials that have verification. Um, when we think about ecosystems in nature, they evolve. They're not, sometimes they're a bit more driven, but quite often they evolve. And so, if we look in the ecosystem, some of the questions that you're asking about third party reliance is really governance and risk tolerance decisions. Um, with the culture that I'm, based in, and having government regulate that dating sites must use a government issued digital credential, I feel a little bit uncomfortable with that level of legislation personally. I mean, we all have different personal views and our personal comfort, but I could very well see an ecosystem where there is a dating site or dating sites that have that verification, and there are dating sites that don't have that verification. And so, myself, as the person in this story who would be dating, I could make a choice about, do I want to go into the platform that has that verification? Do I feel better about that? Or do I want to be in the dating site that does not have that verification? Am I more comfortable with that? So, I think one of the important aspects in the Canadian cultural ecosystem is that there has to be choice. And if people have choices that they can be in a more verified space or a less verified space, that choice is part of them having more comfort, trust, and confidence that they can have the experience that works best for them. But this is
Right.
a dating site, right? If it was a bank, then you have a different regulatory structure and that you have to
Or
adhere to.
what if it's that okay, let's take the correlatable identifier out of the equation, and let's just say that this site wants a verification that you're actually a Canadian person. And
Just
so then
just to give a comment, I mean, maybe the
please,
dating site is a bit for
I
other services, private services. I will go with zero knowledge proof, right? Or just to have a selective disclosure of what information I could input or not. But ideally, well, if it's a dating site, yeah, that's a bit tough. But if it's another private services, I believe we should have, if we have the option to log in or to register with government issued credential, then we should have a strict zero knowledge proof protocol to ensure that we could verify a statement without providing information or having selective disclosure for, I mean, proving that, for instance, I'm from the Congo without necessarily giving my address, without necessarily giving my name, or perhaps just using the fabric to determine that the same person accessed this resource without necessarily identifying myself, because I mean, depending on the services and the use cases. But eventually, the dating site for that, I believe we all want to keep it as far as possible from any government issue. At the same time, the government should be audited by third parties. We should have visibility. What could they do? What could they see? What data could they see? We don't want, we don't want all our informations to be shared, and eventually we have the rights to privacy. So that's the little element I wanted to add regarding that.
right, and that's sort of exactly where I was going, because right, it doesn't seem like that can happen by accident. If we're in an ecosystem where potentially autonomous independent entities like ID.me or Yoti or a bank are providing identities, and we want to create an ecosystem where this third-party trust can flow with privacy, it just doesn't seem like that could happen by accident. And maybe this is where the UK's department, where they are institutionalizing or regulating it, somehow enables this to happen. But
Yeah, and
Joni, any thoughts? We're getting
no,
really like
I was
abstract
yeah, no,
here,
I
but
was just gonna say, like, with like a ID.me as well. I have, close older but close knowledge around ID.me because I ran an organization that certified ID.me for their first access to government contracts to provide these services. So even though it's not necessarily traditional regulation, there is a degree of auditability and a set of criteria that organization was audited against and has been surveillance audited against, at least to my knowledge. So there is a verification there. So they're not entirely kind of off autonomously. There's a layer of checking what they're actually doing.
it's not totally self-asserted
Yeah,
trust.
yeah, exactly.
Um, right, but it's sort of like we want this feature of we want to be able to trust that well, first of all, the government. I have this theory that government shouldn't operate infrastructure. I don't know how you feel about that, but I guess I'm just predisposed to thinking that government should govern and not actually operate, because how do you retain and innovate? And I just think it's hard for the government to operate over the long term. So if we have these independent operators who are operating identity, and we want to get them, but we want citizens to be able to, like, we want that website to say, yes, we want to check to make sure that you're a U.S. person. We don't want any fraudsters from foreign countries who are going to join the system. But we also want to maintain privacy. We need some type of technical way to do that, almost, or some way to define, like you said, how do you get certified? And welcome back, Hasni. So yeah, thank you, Hasni. That was exactly the direction I wanted to go in. And let me ask to go back a step and to say, I agree with you that we want this property of being able to disclose like an attribute without over disclosing, like address or a correlatable identifier. But where do you see the government in terms of operating any infrastructure? Um, uh, like the
Sorry.
my feeling is that the government shouldn't really operate because it's just hard for government to operate over the long term. But how
Mhm.
does government play a role here, if not to operate, to make this happen?
Well, I see the governor as a regulator rather than an operator, really. I see the government issuing the policies, setting up boundaries more than I see them if operating in that sense.
Um,
Can I
yeah,
can
that
I
makes sense. Please.
No, I just, in terms of the government as operator and government as governor or regulator, yeah, I think that, looking at it as an ecosystem play in the sense of uh governments should be, absolutely should be operators as issuers for government credentials. There may be instances where governments should be operators of networks for information sharing for the purpose of government's needs and how you interact with government, um, for the purpose of how people interact with each other and how people interact with businesses and the broader digital ecosystem. The public also gets more of a sense of comfort, like, here where the government share all your information in our government network, even if that network is not, even if it's a very private network and it's not and it's selective disclosure, people will have concern about that. So I think that, again, like, people seeing that operators are different types of operators and that they've been verified in some way gives them a sense of confidence, whereas government may be more appropriate to be an operator as issuers, and then potentially for information sharing that they would need within their authority and within their scope.
Right. Joni, what do you see as the biggest need, like sort of from citizens or from private sector, for better identity? Like, what's the use case that we're pursuing here?
Um, I'm really curious to hear from Hosni on the need as well. For us in the Canadian side of things, one of the, you know, uh, inclusivity, accessibility, 100%. These are key principles that underpin everything that we do. Um, I would say as well, in the Canadian ecosystem, there's a demand for verifiable for verified data. And this is because we do see a lot of fraud in the real estate and real estate title ecosystem. We've seen people access someone else's title and sell their house without them even knowing where are the funds coming from in order to purchase property. So we see a lot of fraud in the real estate ecosystem, and there's a demand for verified information there. Also, a recent in the news in the Canadian ecosystem is around international students, and there is verification that happens for international students and academic institutions. However,
Mhm.
that's not being fully adopted or translated into digital verification, and so it's hard to get real-time data about um, which international students have active visas and where they're going and where they've come from. And I've even heard third-party stories of different jurisdictions are crowdfunding. In order to come to Canada as an international student, you have to prove that you have a certain amount of funds to support yourself, because you're not supposed to be getting a job. You're supposed to be going to school. And I've heard that in some jurisdictions, they see that the organizations are crowdfunding. So you basically have one pot of funds that goes to that student. They get approved to come to
Yeah.
Canada. They move that to the next student. They get approved to come. And it's often not the student that is the perpetrator of the fraud. It's someone on the other side who is, taking advantage of that student, saying, hey, we can get you there and you can immigrate and this will be great for you. But then they find out when they get here it's not as easy as that, and they don't have the funds. So these are kind of two use cases for us, that it's about getting good actionable data that's verifiable, and fraud and students are just kind of two examples of where and how that data should be able to make sure that good actors can continue to do what they do while combating the bad actors in the ecosystem.
I see. So, Hosni, I'll ask the same question to you. Where do you see as the most pressing use cases for identity or better digital identity?
Well, I would say, first of all, of course, assertion. People have the right to have to be able to assert their identity. And then I will also say governments to people funds, securities, funds, and all the social privileges. And of course, inclusion. You want people with low mobility to be able to access certain services without having to move. You have the case where, I mean, there's very low data on access to identity, but there's the World Bank, for instance, is some data is stating that the gender-based difference could be of at least 10% in terms of possessing identities. So, of course, inclusion, assertion, access to government or social privileges, and eventually security. You want your data to stay secure. You want to be ensured privacy. So those are elements that I will highlight as important or priorities.
Hosni, Congo is a very big country. If you lay it over the United States, it's like the whole middle of like the United States, and part of it goes up into Canada. And there's 300 different languages, I think you said, spoken in Congo. What are some of the challenges that you see around building a digital identity system for? Do people have like 3G up there, or what's the distribution of the network and connectivity, and what are some of the implications of having such a vast and diverse country?
Well, it's an interesting question. Well, there's the issues related to internet penetration. However, at the same time, the growth is very fast. There's a fast growth in that sense, in the digitalization. I will say some of the challenges will be to to access remote areas, mostly rural areas. People living in rural areas, that would be a challenge. Another challenge will also be given the humanitarian crisis and the refugees. That will be a challenge, and of course, a challenge in, I would say, vulgarizations or communication, explaining to or educating people on how to use the services, the importance of the services, how to get them, how to use them. So some of it, we will have some considerable challenges, but that are eventually, that we could eventually overcome.
Hmm. It brings up a good point, Joni. Ian Savadello from Australia, they were talking about the Connect ID Australian. And Ian was actually sort of commenting that he thought that the Australian Identity Authority didn't do a good enough job explaining to people what this new credential is and why they should trust it. And part of my response was, well, trust is built over time. And so maybe it's just going to take a while, and there's no messaging they can do to fix that. But also that there needs to be sort of a culture um, around these identifiers. But any thoughts on sort of cultural adoption of this new technology and in Canada, and is there anything we can do to speed that up?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts on absolutely thoughts there. And also to build on Hosni's point, Canada, while not having as many official languages in our ecosystem, we do have the challenge of being a very large country where if you kind of look at a map of Canada, the majority of the
Yeah.
population is just kind of along the border. And when you're at the border of the US and Canada, people who are there have a lot more access to internet, broadband, all of this, and resources in general, versus people who live in the interior, where internet access is more of a challenge and resource access is more of a challenge. So we definitely have that that we're working with as well. But in terms of the, one of the other questions that you asked was about use cases. A big use case that I've seen personally is around combating misinformation and disinformation, and ensuring that democratic principles, and that there is kind of common truths for things that we can understand, and like knowing, am I interacting with somebody who's Canadian or no, because that might change my perception on the discussion that I'm having. So this is a big use case for us, and sometimes I think because Canada is the second largest landmass country, but still at about 39 million people, we do have, when misinformation and disinformation happens, I think it has more of effect in my observation than it necessarily does in the US as a very large, ocean of information. When it comes to the education is very, very important, and the organization that I lead, DIAC, is one of our commitments is, we call it plain language storytelling. We call it Tim Hortons, one of our coffee shops, Tim Hortons language storytelling, meaning that when we talk about these types of capabilities, what they are, how they help people, the risk of not having them, we cannot speak to people in the language that we might speak to each other as professionals. We have to speak as professionals.
No identirati speak, basically.
No identirati speak. I mean, you have to bring it to very commonly understandable, and a lot of times when I write, I kind of really try to write in grade 8, grade 9 kind of level. And that's not, there's no judgment on that. It's just, how can we commonly get these messages out that the most people will understand them? And what I find with the this education component, it's not only the the people, the citizens or the residents who are adopting, who would be the adopters of these capabilities. It's the businesses who would be the adopters. It's inside of government. I've spoken with leaders in different orders of government who said they have difficult times explaining what is digital identity. What are these things? They have a hard time explaining it inside of government. So they also need that very common, very plain educational material, so that others in government who are not experts in this space can understand what it does and why it should be important for them as well. So it's quite often the same language and the same level of education and advocacy that we need to help bring others into the conversation, whether it's my mom or my friend on the street, or whether it's a minister or a deputy minister inside of government who has decision making that they need to do related to this space.
So actually, I should switch to the birds. We're coming up on 45 minutes. Joni, maybe I want to give Hasni the last thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
But before we do that, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I think opportunities to raise up and expose conversations like these, and where our perspectives and our insights are similar and where they have differences, really helps all of us collectively. I find that most of the time we're working on the same patterns, but how we help to address those patterns and those challenges might be different depending on our culture, our location, the different conditions of where we are. And it's not a right or a wrong. It is a very complex space. So I think that it's great that, I would say, number one, continue the information sharing, continue to look for ways that are low risk, low barrier to work with each other and to collaborate. And I think maybe I'd leave where we kind of left in the conversation as well, as while the technology space moves forward, the regulatory and the legal space also needs attention in parallel. We know that the legal space and the regulation space moves slower. It's challenging. And then we cannot forget or leave behind the education and the advocacy part of it, because we really need all of those pieces, the tech, the policy, and the education, to help people kind of get there and understand it. And so, looking at it through a holistic picture like that, I think is one of the key strategies for navigating what is a complicated space. But it always makes me it keeps me in this work to know that there are so many dedicated people who care about people and raising people up and keeping them safe and keeping their data private. So I would just say continue on with all of that. And thanks for inviting me today, Mike.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tony. And Hasni, last thoughts?
Oh, well, thanks a lot. Thanks again for inviting me. Well, I believe identity is important. Being able to assert your identity is important. But privacy is also important. Privacy, security, and the ability to also remain anonymous. And I believe that those the endeavor to provide a digital identity to population is a great one, not without challenges, but of course, having that in mind, doing the proper tests, being committed to transparency could definitely help organization achieve these goals.
Well, thank you for joining. And next episode, we have a talk with Strata Identity on identity continuity, how you can use maybe two different SaaS identity providers like Okta and Entra as backup. Strata, for those of you who don't know, was started by Eric Olden, who's one of like the legends of like the identity industry. He started, this is probably his third or fourth identity startup. And he's actually, one of his companies inspired Glue, and we've been around for 15 years. So join us on next Tuesday. Thank you to the guests for joining us, and thank you to the audience for tuning in, whether that's live or later. Please continue the conversation on the actual episode website if you have follow-up questions. And please follow Identity Office Hours on LinkedIn. We want to get to 1,000 followers. So with that, thanks again, and thanks guests, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you both.